one of the topics these days that is very hot, right? Whether you should be a polyglot developer or not. So coming from your background, learning so many different languages and even expert 5 to 6 different languages that you say you can be really good at. Why do you think developers should think about being a polyglot developers?
I think first of all, there's a couple of different reasons. The first one is that the more different languages you know, it basically makes your toolkit bigger. So if you think about, if you're a carpenter, you have a hammer, but you also have a screwdriver, and you also have a wrench, and you also have a drill, and you have all these different tools, and you use the right tool for the job. A carpenter who only ever used a hammer and never used a screwdriver would be a very bad carpenter. And so it's the same thing with programming. I think different programming languages are different tools and they have different ways of working with the tool. So if you use SQL, it's a completely different way of thinking than if you're using an imperative language like C# or something. It basically changes the way you think about programming. So it expands your mind. So from a personal point of view, it's very good. And then just from a practical point of view, the more languages you know, the more job opportunities you have. That's another thing. But also, when you do work on a job as a contractor, you can just walk onto a job and you're not going to be complaining that you don't like the syntax or you don't like the style or you don't like them doing this way. Some programmers like to rewrite everything using the best way. When I come onto a job, what I call a brownfield project, where the code's already written, like a legacy project, leave the code, use the same style that the people there are already using. Within reason. Obviously, if it's horrible, you can refactor it. But basically, don't try and impose your perfect style on existing code. Just adapt to the style that's already there. If you've done many different languages, you tend to be much more open to that. If you've had limited experience, you tend to be much more picky and you say, well, it has to be this way. This is the only way I know, and this is the way it has to be. That's not very good. As a professional, I don't think you should work that way.
Yeah. A lot of cases these days, especially developers who just came into a project, maybe they started a new career, a new company, or they are consultant, they join a project. So yeah, definitely one of the most common remarks made by those new joiners, of course, the code base is probably not so well done. We should refactor this, we should rewrite. And I think you brought a good point that if you have so many different paradigms and you are familiar with them and maybe also good at it, maybe you can adapt yourself to different code bases, right?
That's right. A good example is I just did a Python contract. I'm very experienced in functional programming. I'm also very experienced in object-oriented programming. But for Python, I think the right thing is just basically a classic kind of procedural programming. And so when I was writing this code, I didn't use a lot of weird functional stuff. I didn't use monads and all this stuff. And I didn't use super nested class hierarchies with lots of inheritance, because I think Python has a certain style of working. Yeah, I have seen people do JavaScript or Python and they bring in monads or they bring in some weird functional stuff. That's not fair to the person who's going to have to maintain it. I would say that's not being a professional programmer. You have to think about other people. It's not all about what you want to do. It's what makes life easier for other people. I would never use advanced functional programming techniques in a project where people didn't care about that stuff. That's not the right way to do it.
Yep. And also I saw one of the most popular tweet that you did. You mentioned that by being a polyglot developer, you start treating syntax as it is. It stops being a big deal that you don't being nitpick about certain writings.
Yeah, a classic example is curly braces. So F# doesn't have curly braces. Python doesn't have curly braces. SQL doesn't have curly braces. A lot of programming languages do not have curly braces. And yet I have seen some developers say, well, if it doesn't have a curly brace, I can't understand it. And I just think that's silly. That's just very limiting. The curly brace does not make a big difference in the syntax of what the keywords are and stuff. That's not the important thing. It's about expressing yourself. So anyone who says that kind of thing, I just think they need to get out more. They need to try more different languages and learn a bit. Get out of their bubble and try some more things.
So let's move to the main topic of today, which is about your book, Domain Modeling Made Functional. These days, a lot of craze about domain-driven design, functional programming as well. A lot of people swear by it. That's like the ultimate programming language. I myself come from more object-oriented programming background. So maybe in the first place, right, maybe if you can share with us, what is functional programming? Why people should maybe try to understand it? And why is it probably much better in some aspects to OOP?
So first of all, there's no official definition of functional programming. My definition is it's a programming style where you use functions to do everything. In object-oriented programming, the basic unit is a class. And in functional programming, the basic unit is a function. In functional programming, if you want to change the behavior of something like the strategy pattern, you pass in a function. If you want to compose a bigger set of functionality, you combine two functions together. Basically, everything you do is functions. You take these functions and you chain them together, typically into some sort of pipeline. You might even have a function where the input is a function and the output is a function. And so you might call that a function transformer. So you basically have some kind of function and it doesn't do what you want. So you run it through this function transformer and it turns into a different kind of function, which does do what you want. So it's just a different way of thinking about how you build software. Another part of functional programming is also immutability is typically the default behavior. Because in a classic mathematical function, things don't change. Like when you say 2 plus 2, the number 2 doesn't change when you add something to it. You get a new number back. You don't change the original numbers. And the same thing with dates. When you add a time to a date, you don't modify the original date. So if you apply that logic to everything, then nothing changes and you always create new things. It makes understanding the program a lot easier because you always know that the things that you've worked on haven't been touched and you've always got new things to work on. So the combination of work using functions everywhere and having immutability, it's a very hard thing to get your head around. When you first start learning functional programming, it's weird. I mean, when I first started learning F#, I was thinking, how can you write any code when everything's immutable? That's just not possible. And then, actually turns out you can, and turns out it's not too hard. And then how can you do things without using classes? How can you write a program with you using classes and methods? Well, it turns out you can. So it's definitely another way of expanding your mind. So why is functional programming now? Like I said, I love object-oriented programming. As I said, I used to do a lot of small talk, and I love small talk. But I think for modern enterprise programming, especially functional programming, because of this immutability and because the composition, there's no inheritance. And so everything tends to be very explicit. Every parameter is passed in explicitly. With class-based programming, there's a lot of implicit code. I mean, you could have a method with no parameters. It returns void and it has no parameters. Behind the scenes, it's doing things because it's using instance variables or something, but you can't really see what it's doing. And that's the whole point of object-oriented programming. The whole point of object-oriented is encapsulation. You're supposed to hide how it's working. But I think functional programming is the opposite. The idea is everything's transparent. Everything is exposed. There's no hidden data. And you might think, well, that's a bad thing. There's no hidden data. But again, if everything's immutable, exposing it tends not to be that bad because you can't change it. Obviously, things like APIs is a different thing. In general, when you're coding, if everything's immutable, it doesn't really matter if people can see the internals of an object because they can't change them.
And one aspect of immutability that I understand as well, right? So if everywhere it's immutable, it also supports for concurrency really well. So you don't have side effects and you don't have to worry about multiple processes accessing the same instance.
Yes, exactly. Although I have to say it's a little bit overblown. I mean, that was one of the things they hyped up about functional programming is it did concurrency really well. It did processing really well, which it does. But even if it didn't, I don't think that's the main reason to use it. I think the main reason is because the programs that you write with functional programming, I think they tend to be a lot clearer and easier to understand. Sometimes with objects, you tend to get what I call object soup, where an object is talking to another object, which is talking to another object, which is talking to the first object. All these objects are talking to each other, and it's really hard to disentangle them. If you'd ever debugged something like that, it's really painful. There's nothing in object-oriented programming that stops you doing that. There's no pressure. It's always easy just to add another method. Functional programming, somehow it doesn't quite do that because the pressure is to keep things simple. When every single parameter is passed in, it's really hard to have 100 parameters. There's natural pressure to keep things simple and make small components that are glued together. So forget about concurrency and stuff. I just think functional programming is a really nice technique. Now, it's not the only technique. One of the things I like about F# is it actually has an object-oriented component as well. So you can actually choose whichever is the best paradigm. Sometimes object-oriented is actually the right paradigm for certain things. And so it's nice to be able to have a language which supports both, and you can just switch between them. But typically, I would call myself a functional first programmer, which is I start by doing functional. And if that doesn't work properly or it doesn't feel right, then I switch to object-oriented.